The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the show. My guest tonight is Dr. Asanka Wijesinghe, Research Fellow, Institute of Policy Studies. Good evening and welcome to you, Dr. Asanka. My first question to you is, a lot of hardships are being faced by the people of Sri Lanka due to the stern austerity measures that the government has had to put in place. And this has to be looked at holistically. If you could set the stage, help us understand. It's clear that the government has had to raise taxes, reduce expenditure. But this has had devastating impacts, especially on the marginalized communities, the low-income earners, those without proper employment. So if you could just set the stage for us, help us comprehend.
Yeah. Well, all of these measures came into effect with the economic crisis. Economic crisis manifested after 2019 as a debt crisis first. Sri Lanka was unable to pay our external debt obligations. It was not just 1 year or 2 years mistake or process, but if you look at data since independence, Sri Lanka was maintaining two deficits. One was the trade deficit. It means we were importing more than we were exporting. Every year we were maintaining this trade deficit, except very few years in history. The other issue was the budget deficit. The government's revenue was not enough for the expenditure. The outcome was consolidated debt stock. It was not sustainable. Sri Lanka had to default on that. Now, Sri Lanka had to got into this IMF program. For that, there was a policy prescription, okay, do these things, and government agreed on different policy measures like raising tax and cutting down expenditures. This is what we call generally as austerity, but austerity is a very intense thing in some other countries, like total cuts in wages, public sector divesting and cutting down expenditure on even general public welfare. We are not seeing that kind of hard austerity measures in Sri Lanka, but increase of taxes, direct and indirect tax, generally have lowered the disposable income. That means the available money for the consumption of goods and services. That is the stage Sri Lanka is facing now. So if we ask, was there any other alternative rather than increasing taxes? Actually, as economists, we don't see any other alternative, because by the end of 2020, Sri Lanka's revenue was close to 9% of GDP. It was historically low after 2019's ambitious tax reforms. So there was a need for increasing government revenue, whether there was no IMF condition or not. It was something country had to do. I think currently the goal is to bring the revenue up to 15% of GDP. That is necessary unless Sri Lanka will be plunged into these shocks we witnessed in 2022-23 period periodically. If we do not achieve the stability in the economy.
When discussing the current economic situation in the country, we must discuss the political situation because the two are deeply interwoven and interconnected at every level. With this comes the topic of policy reforms. If we can just focus a bit on the recent policy reforms of the government, Dr. Asanka, how do you view it and its impacts?
Yes, policy reforms was actually they were tied to the extended fund facility programs reform agenda IMF. One important thing was preserving the revenue-based consolidation. That means increase the government's revenue. Because of that, government had to increase direct taxes. That's what we pay when we earn in our salary payslip. We can see that this much of amount money is deducted from our salaries. And also from 2024 January, there was an increase in VAT, value-added tax. The other thing is expenditure cuts. These things are necessary for restoring public debt sustainability. The issue is with these reforms, there is an uneven distribution of the impact. For example, now we see the goods and services a person can consume is much lower because of the disposable income had gone down. We pay more taxes to the government. So that's the key policy reforms the government is doing right now. In addition, government is trying to rationalize the expenditure. It is a kind of good thing because state-owned enterprises, Sri Lanka had a lot of loss-making, not profit-making, loss-making state-owned enterprises. Now the government task is to make sure in future the government will not have to spend money on these SOEs or bear the loss of that. On the other hand, the government is has embarked on policy reform for international integration. It is necessary because the government's current goal is for export-led economic growth. For that, Sri Lanka needs to get into favorable trade agreements with the other countries. That's why we see a lot of trade policy activism in the country. Different trade agreements are being negotiated.
Let's speak a bit about these trade agreements and the importance of entering into these, how the Sri Lankan government must also be cautious and ensure that we get the best deal out of them. So Sri Lanka-Thailand Free Trade Agreement is scheduled to be signed in a few weeks. There are several other initiatives as well. Speak to us about this whole paradigm, given the fact that in the past we've seen instances where the government has negotiated free trade agreements. However, the conditions have been not very favorable for Sri Lankans, or there was misinformation, disinformation with respect to that, as a result of which there was trade union action, there were various labour groups advocating against entering into free trade agreements. So there has to be a clear-cut set of information that is disseminated to the public. How do you view all of this?
Well, signing a trade agreement, a country expects to lower the trade costs. That means when we export something for the partner country, they impose a tariff on that. For example, Sri Lanka exports tea, and tea is taxed by Thailand government for like 95%. It's a huge amount of tariff at the border. So now it is favorable for us if we get this tariff rate lowered. That's the overall goal of the free trade agreement. But free trade agreements are reciprocal. That means if we get a tariff concession, we have to give something to the partner country. So that's why there are these kind of protests and general negative conception about these free trade agreements, like they are bad for the country. However, empirical evidence show that trade agreements generally positively affect a country's exports. But somehow, some trade agreements are not doing that because, for example, Sri Lanka has signed many trade agreements in the past, especially in the regional context. The issue is both parties, Sri Lanka and the trade partners, they were not open enough to liberalize trade. What they did was they signed the trade agreement but put most of these tariff line in a negative list or sensitive list. We should avoid that if we want to get full benefit for the country. For example, Sri Lanka should be able to get tariff concessions for products Sri Lanka can competitively produce and export. For example, Sri Lanka is producing tea, ready-made garments, and some electronic equipments competitively. So if the partner country is continuing to keep tariff on that, so such free trade agreement is not going to benefit us much. So this is a delicate task. Trade negotiation is actually a delicate task because both countries have strategic ambitions. We try to get as much as possible without giving much.
Yeah.
So the idea should be getting tariff concession for the products Sri Lanka can competitively produce.
All right, fantastic. We are in conversation with Dr. Asanka Wijesinghe. We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
The People's Platform.
තාත්තේ මට ඕනේ මේ වෙලාවේ අභිමන්ට කතා කරන්න. එයා දැන් මේ වෙලාවේ අසරණ වෙලා ඇත්තේ.
ගෙදරින් එළියට බහලා ගිය මනුස්සයා කොහෙද අසරණ වෙන්නේ?
කුරුලෝ මේක තමයි මගේ ජීවිතේ අලුත් පටන් ගන්න.
අභිමන් කොච්චර හොඳට හිටපු කෙනෙක්ද? කොච්චර සැප විඳපු කෙනෙක්ද? ඒ හිටපු තැනට ජීවිතය ආපහු ගොඩනගා ගන්න කී තරම් ලේසි දෙයක් නෙවෙයි. ඒකට ලොකු කාලයක් යයි. අපි මට ගොඩක් දුක් විඳින්නත් වෙයි.
නීල පබලෝ අද රාත්‍රී 9ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
So these are the three industries that, very interestingly, the industries that brings in dollars to this country, right? The tea, the garment, and the migrant workers.
There was a time when the plantation child was seen as a child who was groomed to be a domestic worker. But then things have really changed.
When one domestic worker migrates, I think an employer pays to almost 800,000 to 1 million rupees for one domestic worker.
Not only participation, becoming politician, but also exercising your voting rights as a citizen of the country.
Creating public awareness is one of the important things that should happen. And then the workers need to be organized, and then facilities given for them to sort of organize themselves and demand for their rights.
Face the Nation, Wednesday nights at 9:30 on TV1.
TV1. TV for life.
Another shooting claims the life of a Buddhist monk. How did the Beliatta assassins escape? Much scrutinized online safety bill taken up for debate in Parliament. Debate commences following a vote. Online safety bill will only be amended based on the Supreme Court's recommendations. A new bill to be presented for fresh amendments, says Minister Tiran. A fresh bill agreed by both the government and opposition must be presented. A proposal by M.A. Sumanthiran.
TV1. TV for life.
The People's Platform.
You're watching the People's Platform. My guest tonight is Research Fellow of the Institute of Policy Studies, Dr. Asanka Wijesinghe. Dr. Wijesinghe, when we speak about austerity measures by the government that are resulting in hardships for the people of Sri Lanka, understandably so, we need to speak specifically about the disproportionate impact it has on vulnerable persons. There are the Samurdhi payments and the Aswasuma payments and the other welfare benefits that go to identified individuals. However, over and above this charity and welfare approach, why are we not moving towards a more sustainable livelihood creation, livelihood development kind of mindset, especially for those of us who are untrained and unskilled? We have a large percentage of sex workers in Sri Lanka which we aren't willing to acknowledge. We have other daily labourers, daily wage earners whose livelihoods are up in the air. So why can't we have a mindset shift, an attitudinal shift where we're also looking over and above the welfare payments to a situation where we can create these jobs for unskilled, untrained workers?
Yes. Any country in the world so far, I don't know, capable of making an inclusive economy for everyone. That is why these welfare measures, targeted welfare measures, have been introduced today. Because all the policy regimes, whether it is market-oriented or more closed economies, there will be some left behind segment of the society. That's why we need these different kind of welfare measures. But I agree with you, there should be certain economic initiatives, especially when it comes to the informal sector workers. It is a bit of a hard situation faced by most of the developing countries. Formalizing economy happens with the increase of GDP growth. So rather than one or two specific measures, it will be much effective if Sri Lanka focus on sustainable growth trajectory. Then GDP growth will be increased. As a result of that, more people will enter to the formal sector. For example, before the garment industry was introduced into Sri Lanka, there were not many jobs in the country. Like mostly it was agricultural sector that provided jobs. But with the liberalization, we saw the garment industry flourished. If you look at data in 2022 labor force survey, we can see people who worked in the garment sector, especially women, they were more resilient than the other sectors in terms of employability and also wages. They were not affected as much as other sectors like food. So what a government can do in this case is the question. So as economists, we believe it is to introduce in these different policy reforms, bringing investment to the country, generating more employment. For that, what is happening now is kind of necessary, especially maintaining a stable economy.
When we talk about reforms, it has to be done in a politically feasible manner. And the first sort of thing to do would be to look at the low-hanging fruit in order to reduce the cost to the people. In this backdrop, how do you view the importance of policy stability, given that we are going in for elections later in this year, and we've seen how at times we've suffered the impacts of policy instability?
Yes. Well, I'm kind of a trade economist, so my major focus is trade. In Sri Lanka, trade policy reforms were much demanded for a long time. By that we mean equalizing the tariffs for different sectors. When we try to do that, most of these domestic producers can be affected. For example, if you remove agricultural tariff on imported food products, Sri Lanka's agricultural labor force are going to be affected. It's like 25% of Sri Lanka's labor force. So the political backlash for such measures will be much higher, and politicians would like to avoid that. Instead of that, Sri Lanka can do things that can be done with a small political cost. For example, maintaining a predictable income tax regime rather than changing that every year or when the governments change. It is very important for employment generation and bringing investors to the country. The other thing is SOE reforms actually. Some of the SOEs can be reformed without much cost to the public. For example, Sri Lankan Airlines. People are not going to be affected much if we reform that. Instead of that, if we try to push forward very hard reforms like bringing tariff to equal level in a sudden way, like it's within 1 year, it will be disastrous. So it is important to identify what we can do with low cost. For example, as I said, predictable tax policy regime, land policy reforms, and SOE reforms. These things are feasible things with least political cost.
My final question to you, what is the collective responsibility of the Sri Lankan citizenry in being a key stakeholder in enabling economic recovery for Sri Lanka?
Yes, one thing is to understand the populist policies are bad. Low taxes or wasteful public expenditure on these fancy projects, they are not going to give any return. Instead of that, these things can create long-lasting and deep crisis. For example, what we witnessed after 2019. In history, the people have rewarded politicians this kind of behavior. People voted when politicians spend money for these fancy projects or spend these wasteful activities. Instead of that, we should view what is the most sustainable path. The sustainable path is achieving fiscal stability, economic stability of the country. In that case, it is true we all live in hardships, but maybe we will have to live with these high taxes for some years at least. We recover back to 2019 level. We are not there yet. 2019 GDP level will be achieved even in most optimistic scenarios like in 2028. So until that, certain kind of sacrifices need to be made.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Asanka Wijesinghe.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again tomorrow. Good night.